Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third lesson of the course of History of Costume and Fashion Design. I'm Fabiana Romano, your professor, and let's get started with this period of time, which is very peculiar and will teach us a lot about fashion. Okay, how do I proceed? Let me see. Okay. Nope, sorry. Okay, let's get started. Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third lesson of the History of Costume and Fashion Design course. I'm always Fabiana Romano, your professor. So let's get started and learn about the 20s and 30s in fashion. So let's proceed very quickly. Here we are. So let's talk about this period of time overall. 20s fashion is remembered for its glitz and glamour, and it also was a move toward simplicity in clothing, and this for women meant shorter skirts and simpler shape, while for men it meant also casual suits. At the dawn of the 20s, the world was still reeling from World War One, and the conflict, which had ended just a year before, had a fundamental and irreversible effect on society, but also on culture and, of course, on fashion. And this simplicity created the popular tubular la garçon, which means like boyish, boy look. And this dominated much of the decade. Also known as flappers, the look typified the 20s dress with a drop waist and also with creeping hemlines that could be created in economical fabrics. Fashion in the 20s was all about the whole look, and there were trends in how the body itself was fashioned. And the simple lines and the androgynous shapes replaced the curves. So how do they achieve this new look? Through exercise, diet, and also a variety of shaping undergarments that women use to have this kind of look. While the designers mentioned, not really mentioned, but they created and sold these styles, and also the department store did the same. The simplicity of the prevailing mode throughout the 20s made it easy for the women also that did not have the means to buy in the stores, or maybe clothes made by the couturier, to recreate these styles at home. And also these combined with inspiration taken from typical working class girl attire and the use of materials such as dirty and artificial silk led to what has been deemed as democratization of fashion. But this was also true for menswear. Men move away from starch collars and formal three-piece suits during the day, and they adopted soft collars and one or two button suit jackets, often worn without a waistcoat. So this is like very different compared to the past. And British men were perceived to be sartorially the most elegant and fashionable men, and everyone tried to emulate and to recreate the look of Savile Row and that of the English elite. And Savile Row as Regent Street, you will see, will come later in fashion again and again, because they are like the center of fashion for the British. So let's see what happens in this roaring 20s for men. We have the birth of the dandy. Let's say that we said that Englishmen were at the center of fashion icons all the time, and Also, due to the fact that we have plenty of sports that become fashionable during this period of time, what are the sports that are more practiced in this period? Of course, above all from the ruling classes, of course. Golf and tennis are mainly the two practice sports. And this also brought to new styles that are the sports that were practiced. So golf was practiced wearing knee-length trousers or knickerbockers that were worn with large, long colored socks, and also lace-up shoes and simple shirts or sweater. And on the other hand, white long trousers, a shirt, a checked or other geometric V-shaped pullover, sweaters, cap and shoes. They wear everything strictly in white. That was the uniform of the tennis player. Outside the courts, elegance, as I said, was British inspired. And Edward VIII, who was king for a few months before abdicating to marry the American divorcee Wally Simpson, was the epitome of fashion. The Prince of Wales was considered to be the best dressed man in the world, and he set somehow the guidelines for the 20s. He loved loose-fitting suits with loose-fitting jackets and trousers made out of fabrics like tweed, and he also, of course, liked the Prince of Wales as fabric. Among the most popular 20s fabrics, we find the pinstripes, which were often combined with two-tone walking shoes with leather upper and gaiters in contrasting colors. And so, talking about men, we cannot mention the Oxford bag mode, fashion. Okay, Oxford bag, these pants that the guy that's talking to the policeman is wearing, they grew up in popularity around 1924, 1925, and it happened when the undergrades at Oxford adopted these wide-legged trousers. The original style was about 56 centimeter wide at the bottom, which was like several centimeters wider than the average men's trousers. And Oxford undergraduates began wearing these around the university, and soon the style spread. As the size spread, so did the width of the trouser leg, until at one point they reached up 1.10 m up to 1.50 m before the end of this fashion. And they were made of flannel and came in a variety of colors. They were mostly worn by young people, but you see the gentleman that you see in this picture was not really extra young. He was not a university young, let's say. And the people, the male, they wore them were probably the counterpart of the flappers, and they became a favorite of the so-called Britain's bright young people, a group of wealthy aristocrats known for their antics in London nightlife. And it was due to the fact that they needed a huge amount of fabric to make them, that the Oxford bag fashion lasted only until 1929, when the crisis made it necessary to reduce the material used. But the loss of rigidity in fashion was also visible in other menswear of the time, like shirts that were made with softer plain color. But also the dinner jacket became popular as an elegant garment, including the blue midnight version with a shawl collar used by Edward VIII, while the tailcoat, which was still in vogue, but it was less buttoned and the length of the tails were much shorter compared to the past. So we talked about sport. Let's talk about sport. And let's talk about ladies in sport as well. Because the one that you see here in the picture, she was a French tennis player, Suzanne Lenglen, and she provoked a shock wearing this outfit that was designed for her by Jean Patou, was a designer of the time. But this clothing became a major source of inspiration for the clothing of many young people within a few years. And sport became of great inspiration for the everyday fashion. And the same can be said also for the suits of the famous French tennis player René Lacoste. He was nicknamed Crocodile and invented his polo shirt that bear this crocodile. We still know them today, and he founded his company in 1929, along with another Englishman who was like Fred Perry. On the wave of their sporting fame, because they were two sportsmen, they founded their companies who are very big still nowadays in sport products. And at that time, sports was no longer separated from daily life. So actually, there was a sort of continuity between the two things. And at the end of the 20s, the pleasure of a woman's tennis skin was discovered. And it was seen as a sign, no longer as a sign of poverty, that they had to walk and in the sun and also work in the fields. At that point, it was seen as a sign of health and physical well-being, and Coco Chanel instigated women to get rid of their parasol and not to protect themselves and their skin from the sun rays. So to get away also with the gloves and to shorten their skirts. And now let's talk about the flappers. After World War I, we know that the world actually had an era of prosperity and optimism, and society was pervaded with a new sense of freedom and hope, because after the war there is always a rebirth. There is always a rebirth and a rebuild also. And this is the reason why this period of time was called the Roaring Twenties. And this decade saw many new names in the European fashion. Like we mentioned in the American fashion, Fred Perry, for example. But in European fashion, we have the birth of Lacoste, as I mentioned before. But we have also the rise of names like Coco Chanel, Madeleine Vionnet, or Jean Patou, Jean Lanvin, and Elsa Schiaparelli. The ideal of feminine beauty actually changed radically, and the myth of the femme fatale was actually substituted with that of the garçon, and of course of that of the flappers. But what does flapper mean? Flapper is an American slang, and it has two meanings. One meaning is that of it's an onomatopoeian word, and it is that let's say a word that simulates the flapping of bird's wing. And the second is that that indicated a prostitute that came into the job, that was trying to start this activity. While the flappers were actually seen as very, let's say, restless teenagers that were unconventional and transgressive, and they did. What did they do? They had free sexuality, they drank alcohol, they smoked in public, they drove car like men. And for the day, the most fashionable dress had the straight cut with soft lines, knee length, more or less. And actually, the tunic had belts, but they were placed on the hips, so much lower compared to the waist. And another garment that was introduced into 20th fashion is the sailor neck blouse, which arrived in Europe in 1917 with American troops and was adopted by Coco Chanel, who produced it in typical men fabrics such as jersey, and was worn with a pleated skirt and a cardigan. And let's say that it was one of the many things that she introduced, because the thing that she introduced that is still nowadays extremely fashionable and is actually the epitome of elegance is the so-called petit robe noire, that in English is the little black dress. She introduced it in the 20s and it was renamed the Ford dress because of the popularity it reached. These two ladies that you see here, the one in black is Coco Chanel, the one in white is Elsa Schiaparelli. They are probably the two main players of this period. And you see, the creative world of these two ladies are really opposite, because Elsa Schiaparelli, she was the inventor of the zip. She was the introducer of new color in fashion, which was the pink Schiaparelli, Rosa Shocking, the shocking pink. And Coco Chanel was more austere in her colors, and she made black and white her strong point. Coco Chanel was born in the Loire, and her name was Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel, and she was poor. She was very poor, and when her mother, she spent her childhood in extreme poverty, and when her mother died of tuberculosis when she was only 32, her father took her and the two sisters to an orphanage, the Aubusson convent. And during these years in the convent, well, actually she got inspiration from the convent, and also you see the black and white were the colors of the clothes of the nuns. So the inspiration was drawn by what she had learned during her childhood. And she also learned how to sew. And when she arrived at a major age, she had to move out from the orphanage, so she moved to the boarding school in Moulins. So what did she do? During the day, she worked as a seamstress, so she kept learning how to make clothes, and at night she performed in a café concert, which was called La Rotonde. And was there that she took the stage name of Coco, that was inspired by this very popular song of that time, that was like Cocorico, and that mentioned Qui a vu Coco, who saw Coco. So she sang this song and she became Coco. And it was there that she met the officer Etienne Balsan, that became her lover, and that actually made her make the first move, and he took her to the Chateau de Royette, where he lived, but he was a married man, so she had no chance to become his wife. But it was through him that she met another man, and he was a polo player. His name was Arthur Capel. It was nicknamed Boy, and he was the man of her life for several reasons. First of all, because it was him that took her to Paris, and it was also him that actually financed her business, and she started to make hats. It is quite difficult to reconstruct her biography because she always lied about her life, and she was not very reliable. She always, confused reality with fantasy, and probably she just wanted to somehow had a desire of redemption. On the other hand, we have Elsa Schiaparelli. She was born in Rome. She was born at Palazzo Gorsini alla Lungara. She was a noble. She had, her mother came from the Medici family, so she was like long-time nobility, not young. So she was like a very blue blood in her vein. Her father was a professor of Arabic at the University of Rome. She always showed, since a very young age, an artistic talent. She read a lot, she painted, she wrote poetry, and she was really into art. She loved art, but the family didn't really want her to pursue this kind of career, so they thought to organize for her a marriage. But she moved to London to escape marriage, and it was there that she started to work in an orphanage. And in the orphanage she met Count William de Kerlor, the man that she married, and with whom she moved to New York. She had a daughter with him, but the girl unfortunately fell ill with polio, and the marriage didn't last long. So she decided to move to Paris to devote herself to the greatest passion that she always had, which was art. Also because in the United States, through the friendship of Gabi Picardia, who was the wife of the artist Francis Picabia, she was introduced to the Dadaist avant-garde movement and also to the people of this movement. So in 1922, when she studied in Paris at the house of the Picabia, she discovered also the world of fashion through whom? Through Paul Poiret. He was the first one that actually introduced her to fashion. And she decided to open a small maison, first in the Rue de la Paix, and then she moved to Place Vendôme. And this is probably something that Mrs. Coco Chanel didn't like. And she did it with the help of a seamstress of Armenian origins. But let's talk about the sense of fashion for Chanel. The sense of fashion for Chanel was that that corresponds, let's say, to the very formula of minimalist and monochrome. She never actually produced dress that responds to the logic of embellishment. She always made clothes that responded to the logic of practicality and functional of use. So actually, her dress are not designed to embellish. Since in the history of minimalism and also this was what she followed, the minimalism, it was actually everything was driven by the need for a different position of the role of women in society. So no longer passive wives, but women who took their professional fate in their own hands and they would create their professional life. On the other hand, we have the sense of fashion for Schiaparelli. Well, it was completely different. It was one of ostentation, irreverence, and flair. And it was actually the opposite of Chanel and minimalist. She wanted to produce something that was visible. But, you know, she grew up in a palace in Rome. She was like surrounded by classical art. She was surrounded by the beauty of Rome, and she was also surrounded by the sumptuous embroideries that were in her house. So actually, you know, versus the end of the 20s, women were tired of the garçon vague and which had made the fortune of Chanel, and they wanted something more. In fact, you know, they are considered really rival, but the fact is that they really didn't were matching the same times, because Chanel was more like 1910, mid-20s, and she was like mid-20s and towards the 30s. And in the 30s, women began to feel the need to dress in a very sophisticated, feminine, and luxurious manner. So let's say that this rivalry was like always in the mouth also of the journalists and everybody. Chanel used to call Elsa Schiaparelli the Italian artist who makes dresses, and she did that with contempt. And in Schiaparelli's eyes, Chanel was just a boring petit bourgeoise who, with her fashion in black, specialized in symmetries. So you see, they were very much antagonists, let's say, and they didn't like each other too much. Actually, during an event in which they were both invited, Chanel asked Schiaparelli to dance with her, and she pushed her against a candelabra, trying to actually put fire on her. So as much as Coco Chanel appeared sober, understated, so much Schiaparelli clothes resonate with Maximo overstatement. The year that corresponds with the beginning of the rivalry was 1934. Why? Because, as I told you, Elsa Schiaparelli moved from Rue de la Paix to Place Vendôme, and it was like a stone throw from Chanel's shop in Rue Cambron. And Elsa celebrated the opening with the launch of a line of parfum. There was Salut, Sucy, and Schiap. But as far as parfum are concerned, the supremacy in fragrances goes to Chanel with number 5. But to compete with the newcomer, Chanel decided to actually join arms with Jean Cocteau, who was a surrealist artist, and she tried to create also costumes for the Oedipus Rex, but it was a failure. And it was a failure also an attempt to design costume for the Hollywood production, while on the other hand, Elsa Schiaparelli was very successful, and she conquered the cinema, thanks also to the collaboration she had with Mae West, who was a very famous actress of the time. Another factor of friction between the two women was, of course, social class, because for Coco, Elsa represented everything she always wanted to be, famous, cultured, and at ease in society, in high society. And Chanel, on the other hand, had to work very hard to get into this kind of world, but she was never considered one of them. So Coco Chanel designed clothes because she wanted to be rich and famous and to be able to do whatever she wanted to do, but still she needed men money to do that, because it was a boy that financed actually her adventure, and also other men during their life financed many of her ventures. On the other hand, she was Schiaparelli was rich by family, so she didn't need a man money. She had her own, and so, you know, in both cases, their fashion somehow reflected their lifestyle and also their approach to hedonism. And so actually, for Schiaparelli, freedom meant emancipation, which meant not being financed by a man, but escape from a man, as she did when she escaped from her husband and moved from New York to Paris. So everything that she did was like something else compared to that time. And she decided also to write a book. It was the 12 Commandments for women, and it was like the 12 Commandments that accompanied her autobiography, which was called Shocking Life. And the most interesting thing is a thing that she did for her rival was like 90% of women are afraid of exaggeration and of what people will say, so they buy a gray dress. And as you know, gray with black and white was one of Chanel's color. So you see, there are two different fates, because Coco Chanel returned to the helm of the fashion house in 1954. Schiaparelli closed the door actually in the same time. But and so for a long time, Chanel was very famous, and is still very famous nowadays. Thank God, in 2006, Diego Della Valle, an Italian couturier, decided to revive the house of Schiaparelli, which is now again working both for prêt-à-porter and haute couture. But let's talk about Art Deco. Why do we have to talk about Art Deco? Well, because we need to understand the style, which is refined and very rich. And this is the style of the children of the First World War, of a bourgeoisie that want to leave behind the horrors of the recent past and to get drunk on life, and actually not only that. And the name Deco derives from the term Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes, the International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts that was held in Paris in 1925, and which initiated the new phenomenon involving the decorative arts, visual arts, architecture, and fashion. And on that occasion, over 30 jewelers exhibited at the at the exhibition. And to mention a few, just let me talk about Van Cleef Arpels, Boucheron, Tiffany, and Cartier. Of this period of time is the Art Deco jewelry, of course. And it's a kind of jewelry where gems were cut in many different ways and arranged in pattern of mosaics. But of this time, it's very important, the cocktail ring. It was the famous, there was a time of speakeasiers. What was the speakeasiers? They were like bars, illegal bars, often owned by gangsters, and they actually fueled their business trading liquor, which was, of course, illegal. In these secret bars, they were always attended by the flamboyant flappers. They started to wear these rings. Actually, it was wearing on the right hand. And why? It was like the large jewelry had the dual purpose of distracting them from the fact they were drinking illegal alcohol, but also that of attracting the attention of the waiters when they wanted to be served. And they all do, they did that so, like with the raise of the hand to be noticed and order another cocktail. But why cocktail ring? Because the cocktail, as we understand it today, was actually invented, let's say, in the 20s. At the time, the smuggled alcohol was very poor quality, so to make it drinkable, it was mixed with other ingredients so that it would take a better taste and smell, because alcohol, pure alcohol, was very bad. And actually, the underground drinkers mocked the authorities, claiming that they had the right to freedom of choice by consuming intoxicating drinks with bizarre names that are still on fashion today. One of all is the Bloody Mary. And so actually it was from the unpredictable and singular combination of the clandestine environment fueled by prohibition and the wave of revolutionary energy of the flappers, the definition of the cocktail ring was born. But let's go to the 30s, and the 30s begin with the Wall Street crash. So it changed completely the type of lifestyle and people. So the previous decade that led people living beyond their measures, and this brought also to the collapse of the stock market, and unemployment reached very high rates, and without having these big budgets, companies, of course, look for cheaper way to produce clothing and cheaper fabrics, and so little by little these cheaper fabrics replaced precious fabrics of the other times. And to cope with this raw material crisis, each world power closed its economy to itself, limiting imports, and this gave rise to flourishing experimentation in the field of textile materials. So synthetic and chemical fibers appeared, and they were used to replace silk or cotton that were far too expensive to be produced. And in fact, in Europe, this fiber would only arrive after World War II. These materials were also used to make women's stockings, and in the years following 1929, the price of silk stocking increased so much that actually most of women made up their legs with blush and pencil to make like the line in the back to pretend they were wearing stockings, but actually they did not. In the same years in Italy, Antonio Ferretti made a textile fabrics that substitute for wool from the casein of milk, and he called it Lanital and later Merinova. In this period of time, we have a comeback of sexy bombshells like Jean Harlow and also the divine Greta Garbo. Another icon of this period was Marlene Dietrich, who embodied the role of femme fatale, beautiful, sensual, but she often dressed in male dresses, clothes, and she also smoked in public a lot. So, we have like a new style that comes up. We also have the first trouser suits that are born, and they were very much appreciated by middle-class ladies. And this was the time of designers such as Rocha, Balenciaga, Madelon Vionnet, and above all, Salvatore Ferragamo. And let's talk about Salvatore Ferragamo. Okay, Salvatore Ferragamo was 11th of 14 kids. In 1940, he started very young to make shoes. He actually made his first shoe when he was 9 years old for his sister, the white shoe. But when he was like a little older, his brother, older brother, that had moved previously to the United States, encouraged Salvatore to join him in Boston to work at the Queen Quality Shoe Company, where he was hired. And he also started to make boots, as it was, of course, done by the company. But this is not what he wanted to do. What he wanted to do was to study, and he wanted to study the feet because he wanted to understand how they work, to offer a solution for walking. So he discovered that the weight of the body rests on the arch of the foot. So in the traditional shoemaking, shoes were made giving support to the knuckle and the heel, and they didn't solve the problem of comfort. So Salvatore Ferragamo understood that he had to go in another direction and give support to the arch, because giving support to the arch would allow women to wear high heels in comfort. So he invented and also patented the cambron. The cambron that was used to support the arch and gave to the foot the ability to move like a pendulum. And actually on this discovery, he created his fortune, because actually he became loved by the stars, and it was called The Shoemaker of the Stars. Also the book devoted for his life is titled The Shoemaker of the Stars. So the Hollywood stars looked for him. He started to make shoes for their private life, but also for the movies. It was a time of silent movies, of course, and he opened his shop in Hollywood, actually. But what happened is that he decided to move back to Italy. Why? Because he didn't find actually what he was looking for. So he moved back to Italy in 1927 and settled in Florence. Why? Because he knew that in Florence they were famous for working leathers, and that's what he really wanted. Imagine that Salvatore Ferragamo was also the first one to introduce color in shoes that were before just black, actually, and brown. So he also opened a workshop in Via Manelli and began to experiment with models and also with colors and with fabrics, because we have seen that there were shortening of fabrics. So not only in the United States after 1929, but also in Italy, everywhere else and everywhere. And we saw that the countries closed themselves and tried to use what they had most. So he decided to use what was typical of the place. So Florence was typical for craftsmanship and embroidery and lace, and he started to waving the straws of the very famous Florentine hat for the shoes. And so he created shoes with straw uppers, and he created also artifacts of artistic value, and he was actually also later on awarded for the invisible sandal with the Neimus Marcus Award. It was really unstoppable. He would also buy Palazzo Spini Ferroni, which is today, still nowadays, the headquarters of the company. And he was like the one that introduced many different kinds. He introduced colors, very like the petticoat colors, the red, the green, the yellow, the turquoise. They were colors that were typical of Ferragamo production. But not only, he introduced many different kinds of fabrics in the shoes. He was the one that produced the gold shoes for an Indian lady. And she also designed the very iconic ballerina shoe for Audrey Hepburn, but he continued to have a very strong liaison with the movie system, even when he moved back to Italy. He died very young in 1960 at the age 62. In the meanwhile, he had married with a lady that came from his homeland, Wanda, la signora Wanda Ferragamo. And actually, she took over the company, and they, in 1966, Ferragamo brand designed a velvet boot for Brigitte Bardot, and actually, the following year, in 1967, Ferragamo Son received the Neimus Marcus Award 20 years, exactly 20 years after his father had received it. And in 1970, the company started also to produce menswear. Not only because they already started with, first they started with scarf and seal things, but then they started also to produce women's wear. In 1978, Fiamma Ferragamo, one of his children, designed the iconic Vara shoe. And in 1995, the Salvatore Ferragamo Museum was established and dedicated. It is actually dedicated to the history of the footwear. It is amazingly beautiful, and it's a place to be visited once in the lifetime. In the following year, in 1996, he designed the shoes for Madonna for the movie Evita. And also in 1988, they started to launch glasses. And in 2006, the company received a Rodeo Drive Walk of Fame Style Awards. And this was done for the permanent imprint that the company has left in the history of fashion in the movie system. And this is one of the very few brands that is still owned by the family, and the Salvatore Ferragamo stock has been listed on the Italian Stock Exchange since 2011. So now we are at the end of, actually we have gone also, also not only in the 30s, we have gone already in the 40s, but in the next lesson we will talk of the 40s, and we will see what they meant for fashion. We have wear in this period of time, so you can imagine that fashion changed immediately and completely. So thank you very much for having been with me, and arrivederci.